All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm with Tumwater School District Office. And tonight we have a parent workshop with Miss Candice. For questions this evening, if you want to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, I will be paying attention to that for the class and letting Miss Candice know of your questions. At this moment, we'll go ahead and have Candice get started.
Okay, and I just want to remind people, please don't feel like you can't interrupt. If you have a question or want me to repeat something or clarify something, just let Sarah know and I can stop anytime and do that. So what we're talking about tonight is raising socially and community responsible children. And I was actually really pleased when this is one of the topics that they asked me to do, because I feel like this has been one of my biggest concerns in the last probably 2 decades around parenting. So we have approximately 2 generations now of what we would call child-focused parenting. And anytime you get a new paradigm change in terms of any kind of societal paradigm change, there's generally a lot of benefits. We, generally is evolving to something much more functional as we're learning more about brains, et cetera, in the case of parenting. But there are also inevitably costs as we sort of figure out and try new things. And one of the costs, although there have been a lot of really positive outcomes for child-focused parenting, one of the major costs has been the lack of systemic skills that our kids are developing. So this is a really great topic because it's an opportunity for us to compensate for one of the things that we have figured out we have to be more conscious of when we're doing child-focused parenting. So there's a few things that we can do that can be very intentionally turn this back around again. To being much more functional, even with child-focused parenting. So one of the first things that I actually ask parents to do is to be sure that they're really working with their kids and teaching them to be curious about their community. And one of the things that our parents did as well, and that we tend to still do, is we tend to still really discourage that kind of curiosity, especially about anything new or different in our children's communities. So when kids are staring at someone in a wheelchair or someone elderly or something that's just different from what is their intended community, we tend to try to silence them or to tell them not to stare, or, just because we're embarrassed, thinking we're going to embarrass the people that they're curious about. But I really want people to get way more comfortable about this. So these are opportunities actually for us to help our children learn to be more open and aware of a much more diverse community that they live in. And the thing that I want to remind people is that it's way more painful for people who are different in any way to have someone whisper or someone silence their child, like shh, shh kind of thing, or pretend like they didn't hear them ask or didn't notice them staring or whatever. That is really actually much more embarrassing and makes people more self-conscious who are different. So it's much better to be direct. Now, sometimes you can be incredibly direct and just simply say, if they are saying, why is that person in a wheelchair? You could go over to that person and you could say, could we talk about your wheelchair? And, if it looks like someone is engaging, let me turn that off, is engaging and smiling, it's like you can actually have them talk about what their wheelchair is for and why they're in a wheelchair. But at the very least, when that happens, just feel start to feel more comfortable about just openly talking about why someone might be in a wheelchair or might have some other difference that is unfamiliar to them, as best you can. So that's number one. The second thing is I want people to start really very young. What we know, I don't know how many people are aware of the term intrinsic bias, but intrinsic bias is a brain function, and intrinsic bias is everyone's brain basically starts gathering information from the environment they're in, the community they're in, the family they're in, and we take that information and we order it in our brains. That's just what we do. And we start doing that as early as 2 years old. So we start forming these thoughts and beliefs and biases that as early as two. And so, and there's nothing shameful about that. It's just that that's what brains do. They organize. And when something's different, the first thing our brain does is to see that as a threat or something is wrong, because it's just the efficiency of how a brain functions. And so the earlier we can really start to address differences with children, the less we have of that sort of organization, or sometimes we're assuming that they aren't organizing some of the thoughts that they are. So addressing privilege really early before it feels like something that they need to be defensive about or feel ashamed of. I think that's what stops us from really being able to reach out and be more open about difference. So just to be able to talk about, some people have more options and some people have less options because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of age. We can just start talking about some of those differences that are actually realities in our culture, and the concept then is basically introduced, and from then on we can just openly continue to talk and have dialogues around those situations. So questions about either one of those two things.
Looks like we are clear.
Okay, so the other thing that I really ask people to do is try to provide as much diverse choices in books, in toys, in games, in clothing, in media. Even if you don't necessarily agree with the value or the choices that are provided within those arenas, the diversity of having lots of that gives us the opportunity to talk about those differences, and talk about value systems and differences in value systems. And so it's best to try to introduce and get that opportunity to allow questions, and to basically really see if we can expand that experiential exploration, especially when we, particularly in this particular community, it's quite, it's what we call very ethnocentric. We don't have a tremendous amount of diversity, more so than even some areas of the US, but not a lot. And so part of that brain process is that we are going to have organizing these intrinsic biases about things if we don't get an opportunity to expose ourselves to more. And so these other things like books and toys and media, etc., are an opportunity for us to expose ourselves and our children to some of these more divergent thoughts and values and experiences, and get those dialogues going. So the next thing is to be sure that you're letting your children have an authentic voice. And I think can't remember if we did it this year, Sarah, you may remember, but we have at least one of the years, if not this year, in the past, talked about voice and authentic self. And authentic self is that ability to be able to express who you authentically are in almost every arena you can imagine. So we really encourage parents from a very young age to encourage their children to be very authentic in who they are. And we teach this by allowing them and modeling for them that authenticity. So it's important, for example, not to have your kids come out and say, oh, you know, your top doesn't match your bottom. If their clothing is mismatched, but they seem proud of it and like what they're wearing and feel good about themselves, we don't want you to tell them that they need to shift out into something else to please other people. We're really trying to get them to get that strong, authentic self. Being able to choose music, being able to pick books, their sense of humor, the way they spend their free time, who they choose for friends, all of that has to do with developing your authentic self. And what we know is that if you have a strong, authentic self, you are actually more resilient, number one, when difficult things happen. But we also know that when we are more authentically focused, we are more accepting of others because we aren't threatened as much by difference because we are comfortable with our own unique voice and authenticity. So it is a way for us to become more compassionate and accepting of other people when we develop those authentic selves. So questions about either one of those two things. So we want to both model that authentic self for your kids, and we want to encourage that authentic self. Okay. Anyone before I move on? Now, one of the things that I really want to be sure that we work on is that we also work on, as we're working on this authentic self, that we're working on what we call social communication. In a couple of minutes, I'm also going to talk about civility and social graces. But social communication, there are things that have sort of fallen through the cracks, probably because we have two working parents now, so there's not as much time. We have less extended family. Our community, because we have less time sort of out and about in our communities and engaging people, we've lost a lot of some of that social communication. So some of the things that you want to work on with your kids to be sure that they are really developing that social communication style is appropriate eye contact. And by say appropriate eye contact, I'm looking at two things. In this culture, meaning Pacific Northwest Caucasian culture, we basically expect eye contact as a way of acknowledgement. But it's important when I say appropriate eye contact that we talk about different cultures have a different perception of eye contact. Some cultures find direct eye contact as being abrasive or disrespectful. So we want to talk about what does appropriate eye contact look like and who is that, would that be with? Responding consistently when someone calls your name. I know this sounds really simple, but with child-focused parenting, one of the things we did was we didn't really teach our kids how important it was for them to acknowledge when people were talking to them. So when someone says your name, you need to look up, you need to show them that you heard that you were addressed, and then ideally respond appropriately. It might just be a hi if someone just said hello. to you, but it might be that they asked you a question and you would be expected to respond to that question. And so the other thing that kind of comes in here, as probably all of you have figured out by now, is for ourselves and for our children is technology, because when we are so focused on our screens, sometimes we are not even hearing our names or a question, let alone consistently responding to that. So this is where we have to sort of be thinking with technology now, we have to be even more conscious about being sure that we're really coaching and modeling for our kids what it looks like to respond consistently when someone addresses them. Um, we should be helping our kids know how to greet people and who we greet casually and who we would greet more formally and what that would look like. In this culture, smiling at people when they smile at us, taking turns talking. Some of this is, as we say this, I'm sure a lot of you are remembering that these are things that were actually verbally talked about and coached when you were growing up, and that we have gotten sort of busier and less conscious of some of this. And so our kids are really, we're just not even thinking about coaching this anymore. So it's not that there's any intention to not have them be good social communicators. We just are forgetting some of these things that we take for granted now. So taking turns talking, how to join in on a conversation, to join in on conversations, how to stay on topic and not get stuck on wanting to shift everyone to talk about what you want to talk about, knowing how to read facial and body cues. All of that is what we call social communication. When to have an appropriate tone of voice and the tone of voice you should have, even if you're confronting someone, so that you're learning how to feel heard. It's important, and I think we've been much better in this generation, probably almost 2 generations now, about really valuing that our kids should feel like they have a voice and have a say, and that what they think and feel is important to you and to others. But we've almost gone too far the other way in that we haven't taught them that if they don't use their voice in the right way, if they are too disrespectful, quotes as we would call it, disrespectful, too abrasive, um, too insensitive, too brash, any of those things that take practice and coaching to learn, that even if they have a voice, if they aren't using it right, they are going to be as voiceless as if they never had a voice. So we really have to work with them on how to use that voice in a way that they will be heard and will be considered. Teaching them how to listen without interrupting, to be sure that they are mutually respectful in communication, learning how to eliminate distractions. And again, I think this is one of the things that with technology, we have to own as an issue for ourselves, because one of the biggest complaints that kids have when they're talking to me is that they feel like their parents are distracted by their technology, their phones, their computers, etc., and are not really really having a connection with them. So I think we all have to look. I think we have to model this, and I think we have to teach our kids that with technology, we have to be incredibly intentional about staying socially communicative with the people around us. So again, when we talk about social communication, we're talking about modeling, we're talking about checking sort of time and how much time we're spending. We've got to be able to be doing some good coaching, which means we have to be conscious and intentional and aware enough to be able to do that. So that's what I'm talking about when I say I want an authentic voice, but I also want to be sure that we are teaching kids how to socially communicate in a way that that voice really has some power. So questions about that particular arena?
Looks like the chat clear.
Okay. All right. So when we talk about civility and social graces, what we're talking about here is we're talking about what we would call would be the glue or the common language of any culture. And this is really important no matter where they are. With our kids being global citizens now, it's really important that we go back and work with them on civility and social graces. What happened is, as we had fewer extended families, as our communities were less sort of engaged because we're working more and two parents working, and some of that is fear-based, um, and we are more mobile, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of reasons why our communities have gotten smaller. But as extended families and communities have gotten smaller and we have gotten busier and are working more hours and have more activities that we have our kids involved in, one of the things in terms of working on developing good, strong community and social responsibility is we've sort of dropped the ball in really helping our kids with civility and social graces. Now, one of the things that I think happened is a generation or two, there was so much focus on civility and social graces. And the focus was always about how you would look to other people, that I think there was a big turnoff somewhere around the 70s and 80s about that seemed so inauthentic, and that we didn't want to really teach that kind of quotes inauthenticity. And I really appreciate that. I think there was way too much focus on what other people would think. But as a result of that, we then also didn't focus on that. But there is that still practical purpose of having that social language, that common cultural glue language. And as a result of that, a couple things happen. When you have and know what the language is in your particular culture that is considered civility, um, then you feel more confident because you know how to react in certain situations and with certain people. You also have more opportunities because people with that kind of civility and social graces generally tend to be um, people that we pay more attention to, that we feel are more respectful. If you think about it, if you have your kids have friends who have that kind of civility and social graces, they're the kids that you're more comfortable taking on a vacation with you or going somewhere or having them over. They're just easier to have. So the reverse of that is that people who have those graces get more opportunities. So your kids will get more opportunities if they have those civility and social graces. There also is going to minimize their anxiety. And we're looking at this carefully now because we know that anxiety in the last decade particularly has just been sky high. And there's a lot of things we're looking at. We're looking at some of the social pressures, and we're looking at the economic inequalities and pressures. We're looking at, of course, with the pandemic, it certainly didn't help. So there's a lot of things we're looking at about why kids' anxiety and performance anxiety and so on has gotten so sky high. But we do know that kids who have a comfortable civility and a comfortable sort of handle on social graces do have less anxiety in terms of social and performance anxiety. The other thing is we are going to have what we call global citizen children. It's like they are going to be engaging and interacting, if they aren't already, with people from all over the globe, from all over the world. And if they don't understand even the civility and social graces of their own cultural expectations and language, they don't look for it in other cultural settings, which means they're going to have a harder time if they don't learn to assess and assimilate some of those in a different culture to be able to really assimilate into being a more global citizen. So we're really wanting to teach our kids to look for what are those social graces in our culture, and to make them aware that those social graces and civil behaviors change from culture to culture. And these are how you look to see them and find them and observe them and participate in them. So that's really important. It also diminishes entitlement, because we're really having to think about, are we meeting needs of other people by trying to be civil, some of those civil and social graces, and also if we are giving attention, enough attention, attending to other people. So there's many things that really come from helping your kids with civility and social graces. And I think now that we understand what it is and the value of it, we can still really help them maintain their authenticity and be able to have that common cultural glue language. So some of the things that you want your kids to be conscious of in terms of their civility and social graces are, and I think on your sheet you have a little place, so you should have a sheet that says civility and social graces. I'm just going to list off a few of them for you. There's actually many more that I'm going to list. And as you start to pay attention to these, you're going to start to recognize that there are things that you are going to want to write down to remind your kids about what those social graces are. Okay, so do you want me to go ahead and do that, or do you have questions before we make that list?
It looks like we have a question in the chat. Ms. Karen is asking, when is it appropriate in your presentation? Will you please say how you might introduce the topic of social graces to elementary kids?
Okay, so the introduction, I believe, should happen well before, and probably has been happening well before elementary. So even with toddlers, very quickly, we model, ideally, because it's the fastest way of learning is modeling. We model, for example, please and thank you, and excuse me, probably even before they get to school. And so those are, some of the early basic social and civil and in terms of our social graces. And then we just go from there. Now, somewhere between 7 and 8 years old is when we start thinking abstractly. And so we're going to be modeling like crazy these social graces long before they are abstract thinkers, around 8, let's just say. But when they are 8, I think it's really important to really give it, meaning social graces and civility, give it a definition for kids when they do have abstract thinking, so that they understand these things that we're coaching them to do are not fake, or are not just doing it to control them, or not just doing it to make yourselves as parents, quotes, look good, which is what I think a lot of kids think this is about. But for them to really understand that these are behaviors that connect communities, and that will make them more confident and comfortable in their own community. So we'll be modeling and teaching, and then really talking about that the abstract concepts of this as they hit 8 and older. Okay, did that answer your question for you?
She says yes and thank you.
Okay, so some of the things that you're going to be working on is how to greet people. It was interesting to me that one of the times when I was working in a village in West Africa doing some research, there was a group of preschoolers. They were kids, I would say 3 to 5 or so, that every single morning, the very first thing they did for the longest time, I'm like, I just kept thinking, how do they keep these kids' attention? But they did greetings for a half an hour or more every single morning. So they would be, how do you greet a grandma? How do you greet a friend? How do you greet? And in that culture, in that language, there were different words that you used as a greeting for people who had different sort of layers of what they would consider respect, etc. So theirs was very complex, but what was really interesting to me is how much value they put on both teaching that cultural and social language, that glue language. So knowing how to greet people and when to greet people, how to respond to a greeting. This is similar to some of that social communication I was talking about. Knowing about opening doors for people, holding doors open for people, to be conscious enough to recognize who might need a door held or opened for them. All of the sort of courtesy words, please, thank you, excuse me, and so on. How to answer a phone, especially with technology. A lot of your kids don't even have a landline anymore, but there still will be landlines for businesses and things. And so they have to know how to answer a phone. And that sounds silly, but when you think about it, we generally just sort of, turn our phone on and we know who's calling and we just start talking, or they just start talking, or even they don't even talk, they just text. They don't even talk very much on their phones. So we need to be able to teach kids to know how to answer a phone and how to get off a phone. And one girl lost her job, her first job, that she was working for a photographer as a receptionist here in town, because he happened to walk in and she was talking to someone on the phone and gave information, but she just hung up without saying goodbye or anything. And he was just outraged by that. But the bottom line is, it's all our kids know. They don't see us have a greeting on a phone, and they don't see what appropriate hanging up a phone looks like. So we have to actually teach some of those things that were before almost organically learned. So they have to know how to answer a door and when to answer a door in terms of safety. They have to acknowledge when someone enters a room, and they have to acknowledge when someone leaves a room. We, as even our adults, are sometimes very unaware of someone coming in and not greeting them, saying, hi, so and so. We're focused on TV, or we're focused on our phones, or we're on the computer. So having to relearn to be more conscious of the people who are actually physically entering our space, and teaching your kids that they need to look up from their phones or their computers and acknowledge someone when they walk in or when they leave a room. Basic table manners. They don't have to have perfect table manners every meal, every day, but to know what basic table manners are is going to be something that's going to make them feel more comfortable and confident. Knowing how to interrupt a conversation, where to interrupt a conversation. They have to know how to wait in line. It was really interesting. Two things came up. One was a group of kids, grade school, elementary school kids, who went to a museum on a field trip a couple of years ago, and actually were asked to go outside, and they talked to the adults and said, this can't happen. These kids are not appropriately waiting in line. And then another group of middle school kids went on a field trip to Port Townsend and actually had a letter written saying how, by a couple of the people in the proprietors of the stores, who said they were so impressed with how respectful and appropriate and the social graces. So it really points out that these social graces are going to make a difference when your kids are out in the world. So how to wait in line, party etiquette, and etiquette for being a host, teaching our kids that if you're hosting, your host gets to choose what game to play or what show to watch, um, or that they might get to choose the first piece of cake rather than you taking it. You give them the first piece of cake, or. Those are what we call party etiquette or hosting behaviors. Accepting and giving compliments. Do your kids know how to give a compliment? Do they know how to respond to a compliment? Do they know how to decline food appropriately? It doesn't mean that they have to eat everything anymore that someone gives them, but they have to know how to appropriately decline food. Do they know how to listen attentively? We've done a really great job, as I said earlier, teaching our kids to have a voice, but haven't been so great necessarily about teaching them to actually listen to other people's voices. And have we taught them how to ask for help appropriately? Sometimes in child focus, we are so quick to help them without them even asking, that that's one skill they haven't had to learn, is to truly have to ask for help and be able to say what they need really articulately and appropriately. So I could go probably on and on and on with other social graces, and if anybody wants to add more to that list tonight, but I think you're just going to find that you're going to start remembering some of the social graces yourself. And the main thing here is to be sure you're modeling them and that you're really coaching your kids to have those social graces. So questions about that?
Chat is clear.
Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is, as a community, we want, now your kids are all old enough by grade school, that you want to be sure that you are talking about current events in a developmentally appropriate way. And I know this is really hard for people, especially those of you with like the younger grade school kids. And it's hard to talk about some of the really hard things that's happening in the world, in their community, in their families, etc. But one of the things that I spend a whole long time, hour or more, on is talking about the importance of being able to go to those really difficult, hard places with your kids. And part of the reason I'm saying this is that that's how we learn to be socially responsible and compassionate and so on. But also, the thing that breaks my heart the most about this is that I think that parents are sometimes naive about what their children are exposed to. By the time when your kids start going to actual school, they are going to hear about things from their peers and from other people. As soon as they can begin to read, they're going to be able to see pictures and read headlines in a grocery store line or on the internet. And what we tend to do as human beings is we interpret what we see, hear, read by the life experience we've had. So if an adult isn't interpreting for these kids and helping them understand what they're seeing and what they're reading and what their peers may be saying to them about some of these harder, more difficult events that may be happening in their world, in their community, they're processing all this from the life experience they have. And I think parents just assume that they're staying naive and not aware. But I can just absolutely say to you, over the years, you would be shocked what your kids are hearing and knowing and seeing that you aren't processing with them. And I don't want them processing this with their little minimal amount of life experience or with their peers who also have very little life experience. I want to be sure that they're processing this with adults who have the life experience to help interpret some of what is happening and what they're seeing. So questions about that, talking about current events. Anything, Sarah?
Are clear.
Okay. With that said, I just want to quickly go back through the respect piece again. So I want people to, when you're having these conversations with your kids, I want you to be sure you're thinking about where they are developmentally in terms of how much information you're giving and how much information or how much life experience they have that they could even understand what you're giving them for information. But I also want to be sure at any age, even when they are more abstract in their thinking and more mature, that you're modeling being ever respectful as you talk about these events. So I just want to quickly go back through what respectful behavior is. And there are basically 4 components to respectful behavior. Those 4 components are basically behaviors of integrity. So when we talk about respect, I don't want to talk about it as a feeling. I want to talk about it as a behavior of integrity. And we want to model that if you're a person of integrity, you treat people and talk about things respectfully. Those 4 components are, number 1, trust in the ability of others other than our own, to be able to be curious about or interest, you can put it either way, interested in the point of view of others other than your own, to recognize and own our part of a problem, and to recognize and accept that others have feelings different than our own, even sharing the same experience. So those are the 4 components of respectful behavior, respectful dialogue or conversations. So questions about any of those before we move on?
Clear.
Okay, great. All right, so the next thing that I want people to be conscious of as we're working with our kids to be socially and community responsible is that we are going to need to fill in the gaps that can't be taught in school regarding history and culture and so on. So differences and around races and sexuality and so on. So we can't expect that school can take that total responsibility. So we have to really be the people who we are conscious of filling in those gaps of teaching about those differences. We have to model and encourage volunteering and service. Now, this is interesting because this one is, we really found that this made a difference when the pandemic started, because a lot of the um, volunteering that we both could model and the volunteering that our kids could participate in dropped off, obviously because of safety concerns. As a result of that, what also dropped off was a sense of usefulness in our youth, and a sense of a purpose in our youth. So there's really positive things in terms of our kids' resiliency and self-esteem, let alone their social and community responsibility. So it's important now that our society is opening up again, and it may vacillate. We may open and close depending on what happens in the future around the pandemic. And as it evolves. But I think it's really important, again, to be looking at and starting to talk again about how can we volunteer? How can we contribute to our community, our society, our culture, our world, any ways that we can both model that, and as quickly as possible and as young as possible, get your kids involved in that kind of volunteer and service model. So that's the next thing I want people to look at. I want you to also really work with teaching your kids to be critical thinkers and modeling to see something, say something, do something. This is really important. One of the things that happened as we lost this sense of community, extended family, etc., is we got a much what we call smaller circle of caring. Circle of caring are the people that you know and care about. And when the people that you know and care about get smaller, you don't have as much reason to care about them or them to care about you. So we're really trying to get this little tiny circle of caring that we sort of ended up with, partially because of the pandemic, but way before the pandemic, we had really small circles of caring because we just weren't out and about in our neighborhoods anymore. We really just weren't out as large community gatherings anymore, the same way we had been. So we're trying again to open up that circle of caring, which is really important to do. And as that circle of caring opens up, so does our sense of responsibility to the people in that who are vulnerable or who need our assistance and so on. So then once that circle of caring gets opened up, then we're able to start to really coach them about when you see something that looks hurtful, you can say something, and then we coach them about how to say something. And then ideally that we would see it, say it, and do something, and what do something would look like in different situations. So it's important that we are really opening up that circle of caring again, that we're modeling like crazy what it looks like to say something or see something, say something, do something ourselves, and have that be the model for our kids. That could be around homelessness or racism or sexism or mental health or bullying, unfair treatment. I just want our kids to see what it looks like to function as a loving, compassionate community and society. Okay, so questions about any of those things before I move on? Okay, so The next thing is, interestingly enough, we're going to help our kids learn to have more humility and honesty and pride in lifelong learning. With the pressure that we felt ourselves and we have put on our children, they are, many of them now, really exhibiting a lot of perfectionism, a lot of performance anxiety. They feel like knowing is more important than learning. And I really want to try to get that turned around. I really want us to model and teach our kids what it looks like to say, I don't know. Not only do I not know, but I am excited about learning something I don't know. Not feeling like there has to be there's some failure that I don't know everything. And so I really want to see if we can flip that into lifelong learning paradigm instead of a perfectionism and a sense of knowing being the ideal versus learning being the ideal, which then will come out as more humility, more compassion, more authenticity, which will make our communities more engaged and healthier. The next thing is helping them recognize systems that they live in and how they can be responsible within each of those systems. So their first system is actually their family system. And as what would I call it? As one of the costs of our being so child focused is our kids really have much less sense than we did, and certainly 2 or 3 generations ago, of the importance of being involved in their family system. Not only the importance, but the responsibility and the function of being involved in their family system. So it is not unusual in this generation for kids to have little to no responsibility with even in their family systems. I would say that by the time your kids are 9 years old, there shouldn't be a single function in your home, a single chore, inside or outside. And I say that with maybe the exception of power tools that they may not be able to manage the way they should, but there shouldn't be near anything that they can't do. They should be able to clean a bathroom by the time they're 9 years old. They should be able to vacuum adequately, mop a floor, do dishes, empty garbages, wash clothing. And what we know is that we have kids who are launching off to their own independent living, either through college or moving out and traveling or whatever, who don't have those skills because they didn't learn those skills in their family systems. They also didn't learn that those systems were more functional when everyone was participating. Sometimes their first learning of that has been when they go off and they are living with roommates. And I cannot tell you how much stress, those of you who may have older kids who have already been doing this, how much stress there is for these kids because so few of them have systemic skills. And so there's incredible frustration about living with roommates and who's doing what and who's considering who, etc. So our first real system that we want our kids to learn how to function in is our family system. So we're not doing them a favor or being more loving by doing everything in that family system for them. We really want to be clear that they will be better off and our system will be better off if they are participating wholly within that system and prioritizing it. because over the last couple generations, we've seen the family system actually go down in terms of prioritization to school and extra activities and socialization. Whereas in the past, what it looked like was, I would say that family systems originally came first, then school, then extracurricular activities and socialization. And now, in all fairness, we do value school very much. And so school, family systems, extracurricular activities, and socialization. And so we have to be doing some shifting again in what we're really modeling and expressing in terms of our expectations and our value systems if we're going to start having them look at themselves as being responsible for their first community, which is family community. Then as they get a little older, we start having them look at what are their responsibilities within their communities, meaning, their school, their neighborhoods, etc., and having expectations and modeling what some of those responsibilities are. As they get closer to launching, we're going to then expand that into the world and say, what is our responsibility globally? What are some of the things that we can and should be doing to contribute to our largest community, which is our global community? So we start with, first of all, even understanding that they live in systems and that systems are valuable and they are going to be in systems their whole lives, and starting with family and moving to community and on to globally. Okay, so questions about recognizing systems and working within systems. Okay, modeling charitable acts, doing something that is a gift to someone else. Charitable acts can be money. Charitable acts could be going over to a neighbor's and raking leaves when you see that you could do that for them. Charitable act could be bringing a cup of tea into your mother on a weekend. It can be all kinds of things, but I think that our children really have struggled in recognizing what being charitable and generous looks like. And I think we can't blame the victim for that. I think sometimes we've sort of lost our consciousness of, are we being charitable in our own behavior? And I would say, ideally, if we could really talk about it overtly, we should all be doing something every single day in some form of charitable action. Like I said, we're not talking necessarily, people say, well, I don't really have the means to do that. And some people say, I don't even have the time to do that. But I don't want people to think that being charitable is always got to be some massive act. It can be, like I said, some simple thing, like washing the dishes when it wasn't your turn to wash dishes, or the expectation. So really modeling more charitable behavior, both to your children, to your partners, to your friends, to your community, etc. Okay. The next one is teaching your children to stand up for their rights and the rights of others. And then with that goes back again to that social communication that we talked about earlier, that as your children are going to have a voice in being able to stand up for themselves and for other people, that right isn't going to be heard if they can't communicate that in a way that it can be heard. So this goes back again to really working with your kids on being able to have the voice that will allow them to stand up for their rights and to speak up for other people's rights. including being respectful. Okay. The next thing is traveling in teaching ways, because for many of us, we have the privilege of being able to travel in ways that some people absolutely do not. And if we have that privilege, to be able to use that in a responsible way. So we could do things like actually immersing ourselves in a community to really learn how that particular different community functions on a trip, or learning the cultural civility and social language by immersing ourselves for a period of time instead of doing sort of more the touristy things. We could have our kids be involved in what we call working vacations, where you go on a vacation and you do something to contribute socially, environmentally, etc., health-wise, etc. So taking some of our privilege and being able to use it as a way of teaching and modeling community and social responsibility is something that we definitely want to look at. And then the last thing is really practicing gratitude. And that means really, one, having our kids actually share and say thank you and genuinely appreciate the gifts they're given on a daily basis. And anything over a basic need is a gift. So those of you who haven't ever done overindulgence and entitlement with me, basic needs are food, basic clothing, basic having some kind of structure to protect us from the elements. It would include some safety, for water we can eat, drink safely, etc. So safety are basic needs, and love. Those are basic needs. Anything over basic needs are a gift. So when our kids get to participate in an after school activity or a sport, that's a gift. That is not an entitlement for them. That's a gift. And to be able to name things as gifts, and to be able to have your kids be able to acknowledge that they do know that they have experiences and things that are beyond basic needs, and that they have gratitude for that. So modeling that, helping them learn that. What we know is that children and people who know they live in some level of abundance are much happier than if they think they live in constant deprivation. And our children have a real struggle with that because they don't know how gifted they actually are, oftentimes in this culture. So really helping them recognize that, and then doing things like verbally expressing that gratitude. And one of the things I realized is that I started making my kids actually write thank yous when they got gifts from grandparents and relatives, because I realized that it was just too easy for them to just get on the phone or send a quick text off to grandma and say, thank you for my gift or whatever. And not even really taking time to think that they actually had to think about what they might want and go out and take the time to buy what they might want. And in some cases to actually mail what they might want. And I thought, my kids, I want them to put some energy and to actually showing some gratitude for what they get. So I just noticed how different it was when they had to actually write acknowledgments versus sort of the ease of our technology. So any of the things that we can do to really model and coach that will make our kids more socially community responsible. Okay, so that's kind of the basis of our lecture tonight, does anybody have questions about this, comments about this, and or anything in general, since this is our last get together?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
You can open it if people want to unmute themselves too, Sarah, if there's anyone who has a question or anything they want to share.
Everyone just Karen says, thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of your presentations.
Good, you're welcome.
So yes, I have everybody open to speak. It does look like everybody is muted. So if you would like to speak, you would just have to unmute yourself.
Sounds like we're good, Sarah.
Michael just says, thanks. My head is spinning with the ideas.
Oh, good. I love it when people's heads are spinning with ideas. That's great. Thank you, Michael. All right. So I think we're good, Sarah. And thank you guys. And thanks for showing up tonight, you guys.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Miss Candice. These
You're absolutely welcome.
are just splendid.
All right. Good night, you guys.
Everybody take care.